So if you've been to church for a bit, chances are you've heard the parable of the Good Samaritan before. Chances are you've heard a good sermon on the parable of the Good Samaritan before. And even if we're not church people, you may have heard of the parable of the Good Samaritan without knowing it. For we have in our vernacular the idea of being a good Samaritan, of being a good neighbor, even to those people who we don't know very well. In thinking about our context here at St. Margaret's, at this parish, in this diocese, in this city, in this time that we find ourselves when the arc of the moral universe seems nearly to have slowed to a standstill. It seems to me that the parable of the Good Samaritan is the quintessential gospel lesson for people like us. We are people who are especially concerned for social justice. As you may have heard before if you visited St. Margaret's, and if you know of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, you've heard how we are a people who have a long-standing track record of fighting for justice, for women's equality, welcoming the LGBTQIA+ community. We're a church that has opened its doors to the hungry and homeless of our city, and recently, over the past year, have helped settle an Afghan refugee family. So in many ways, this Good Samaritan parable is one that we seek to embody day after day. It's a story we know and love because in it we find affirmation of our conviction that we share, that a primary part of being a Christian is ministering to those who are on the margins, loving our neighbor as ourself, through acts of hospitality and charity, reaching out to those in need. That's what being a Christian is about to us. And there's one thing in this passage in particular that drives home such a conviction, and it's the fact that Jesus uses a Samaritan as the hero of the story. That's what makes it so powerful. See, Jewish followers in first century Palestine despised Samaritans, all the people from Samaria, and the reasons it would take a little bit of an Old Testament class to really dig into, but the reasons harken back to days of ancient grudges, conflicts that were then passed down through the generations. And these grudges and conflicts over time just kind of got enmeshed in the culture and in the tradition to the point that any average, upstanding, respectable Jewish person in first century Palestine would have nothing to do with those Samaritans. And so we read this parable and immediately feel called to be like the Samaritan, to offer radical service and care to those who find themselves marginalized or beaten down on the side of the road. And still, I wonder if there might be another message for us in this text. What would happen if, rather than identifying as the Samaritan in the story, as we are often called to do, we instead place ourselves in the shoes of a different character? Is this parable simply calling us to help those in need, or is there something more going on here? I'd like to share with you a bit of how my understanding of this passage has really evolved and matured and grown because of my presence among you, the people of St. Margaret's. This Sunday, Facebook tells me, is exactly 5 years that I have served as a priest at St. Margaret's. And when I first joined you as associate rector, one of my roles was to be the parish missioner. And one of the primary ways that I lived out that particular ministry was by being present at Charlie's Place. Charlie's Place is St. Margaret's cardinal ministry with our homeless and hungry neighbors. It's been around since 1990. We have a feeding program, a clothing closet. And ever since those first many months of showing up day by day at Charlie's Place, trying to build relationship, trying to make myself helpful, Charlie's Place has had a special place in my heart. And I'll be honest to add that it has also been one of, if not the most challenging and rewarding parts of my ministry as a priest at St. Margaret's. Challenging, I say. Would you allow me to be a little bit more direct why that is? If we take the traditional interpretation of the parable, when I first started at Charlie's Place, I saw myself as the Good Samaritan. I saw our guests, our neighbors experiencing homelessness, as the Jewish person in the story who was beaten, stripped, robbed, and left for dead on the side of the road. And I say getting involved at Charlie's Place at the beginning of my tenure was challenging because, given the social location that I inhabit, I'm conditioned to want to maybe behave more instinctively like the priest or the Levite in the story. I want to cross the other side of the street. And so to engage in ministry at Charlie's Place has been challenging because it brings me face to face with people who couldn't be more different from myself. And it's challenging. It's challenging to experience such poverty and brokenness, just as it is challenging to witness it, mental illness and addiction, and all the related things one might experience when you're sleeping rough, when you're sleeping out on the street. And part of the reasons that it's challenging is that it makes me aware of the divide that exists between us, the privileges I experience compared to our guests at Charlie's Place. And so it wasn't really even a conscious thing that I began my ministry at Charlie's Place with the Good Samaritan model in mind. Because as a person with privilege, as a Christian, as a new priest, I had the responsibility, I felt, to show up, to do what I could, to help distribute the food, to talk to people, to build up trust. And I was very happy when we could provide just the right article of clothing from our closet. I was thrilled when we began offering a weekly Bible study and prayer group. And I really wanted to make a difference. You all know me, I'm a recovering perfectionist, right? So I tried to make myself some would-be expert on homelessness in our city. I talked and got advice from all the people who've been doing this work far longer than I had to get their advice. But see, not too long into my ministry at Charlie's Place, I came to realize something. And I know many of you, I'm preaching to the choir, if you've been involved at Charlie's Place or a similar ministry, you've had this experience as well. Eventually, I recognized that I was not the Good Samaritan. I began to understand that I was not being called to minister to our guests at Charlie's Place as if I alone had the ability to solve all of their problems. Instead, I, if anything, discovered that the guests of Charlie's Place were and are the ones ministering to me. Contrary to what tradition would hold, I do not believe that we're intended to identify with the Samaritan in this story. Jesus is meant to be the Samaritan in the story. We are invited, we are meant to be the Jew. We are the ones who have been beaten up, robbed, stripped, and left naked to die on the side of the road. We are the ones in need of salvation. I, for one, am someone who longs for authentic relationships. I long to be understood and to love unconditionally. I long to be forgiven when I screw up. I long for our world to be more just and equitable, and I would be happy for all of those things to be ushered in by the priest or the Levite, people who look and think and vote and act like me. But the point of the parable, I've come to believe, is to show us that it is from the most different among us that we are to receive our salvation. Jesus came to us, came to Israel in the form of a Samaritan other, a despised brown man from a despised poor town of no consequence. Today, Jesus continues to come to us in the form of whomever we would identify as an other. In her homily at our closing ceremony for Sacred Ground earlier this year, my friend and colleague, our Associate Rector, the Reverend Diana Gustafson, she preached about the Good Samaritan too. And she said something that I know any of us who have done a critical examination of racism within ourselves, racism in our country, could identify with. Diana preached the following: if there's one thing that Sacred Ground has taught me, it's that I'm fallible and broken. I'm a sinner and probably more racist than I want to believe, and I need God to heal me of that brokenness. Every one of us is lying in a ditch, searching for truth and salvation. Jesus is telling us that we have been broken by our actions, beaten to a pulp by the impossible task of being human. Jesus is telling us that we are no different from the people we seek to help. We are all in a ditch together. So, my friends, this morning I would ask you to identify with this beaten up man on the side of the road. I'd ask you to flip the story around in your head and be the lawyer who asks Jesus the question, who is my neighbor? And consider this an invitation sincerely to pray on that question, to ask Jesus in prayer that very question, who Jesus is my neighbor? As Diana mentioned her sermon too, when you spend that time in prayer with this passage, you can also ask yourself, who else is in the ditch with me? How might I be a person who offers themselves to that person? And how might I be open and honest with them? How might we be healed together? I can't wait to hear from you how Christ answers you in putting this question of who is my neighbor, and how are we called to be healed together? Amen.